All right, so today we're diving into something pretty major happening over in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Things are, well, they've taken a turn that I don't think anyone really expected. Our main source today is this report from Channel News Asia.
Huh.
And the big news is that North Korean troops are actually on the ground in Ukraine, fighting alongside Russian forces,
Wow.
which is, yeah, it's a big deal. This is the first time they've gotten involved in a European conflict since the Korean War, so... The article mentions thousands of North Korean troops deployed to the Kursk region of Russia. Now, I'm not a geography whiz, so
Yeah.
can you maybe give us a little rundown of where that is and why it matters?
Sure. Yeah, so Kursk is right on the border of Ukraine. So these troops are basically right next to the front lines. And I think what's interesting here is not just that they're there, but what it means for the bigger picture. You know, it shows that North Korea is really serious about supporting Russia.
Yeah. It's one thing to talk the talk, but now they're walking the walk. And this move hasn't gone unnoticed. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has already come out and condemned it, calling it a profound and incredibly dangerous development, which sounds pretty serious.
Yeah, definitely.
So what can the U.S. actually do about this?
Well, they've got a few options. On the diplomatic side, they could try to put more pressure on North Korea, maybe through sanctions or by trying to isolate them even more on the international stage.
Okay.
They could also target North Korea's economy, which is already pretty shaky to begin with.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the military angle. I don't think direct intervention is very likely.
Right.
But they could increase their presence in the region, like sending more troops to NATO allies or giving Ukraine more advanced weapons.
Like what kind of weapons?
Oh, things like advanced air defense systems. It's all about sending a message, you know?
A message of don't even think about it.
Exactly.
So you mentioned NATO. For anyone who might not be totally up to speed, can you give us a quick explanation of what that is and why it's relevant here?
Sure. So NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a military alliance that was formed after World War II.
Oh.
The main idea is that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all of them.
So they all have each other's backs.
Exactly. So when the U.S. increases its military activity in NATO territory, it sends a pretty strong signal.
To Russia and now North Korea, too.
Right.
It seems like the stakes just got a whole lot higher.
Yeah.
And the game board has expanded way beyond Ukraine.
Yeah.
And what does this mean for the global power dynamic?
Well, it's definitely adding fuel to the fire. First, it increases tension between the U.S. and North Korea.
Which already wasn't exactly friendly.
Right. And it also strengthens the alliance between Russia and North Korea. They both want to challenge the U.S. and its allies.
So they're basically teaming up against the West.
Pretty much.
But then there's another big player we haven't talked about yet, China. They're pretty tight with North Korea, so their reaction to all this has got to be significant. What are they thinking?
Well, China's in a tricky spot. They don't want to upset Russia. But if they openly support North Korea's actions, it could backfire, especially if things get even more unstable in the region.
Yeah, that makes sense. So they're walking a tightrope.
Yeah, you could say that.
What could they do to try and influence things?
Well, they have a lot of economic power. They're North Korea's biggest trading partner, so they could use that as leverage to try and pull them back a bit.
Oh, okay.
On the other hand, they could also quietly support Russia, maybe with economic aid or by helping them get around the sanctions.
So they have a lot of options, but they have to be careful.
Exactly.
So we've got North Korea jumping into the fight, the U.S. trying to figure out its next move, and China playing its cards close to the vest. But here's the real kicker. This is all happening as Donald Trump returns to the White House.
Oh, wow.
And I think we all remember how unpredictable he could be when it came to foreign policy, especially with Russia and North Korea. So given his track record, what are some ways he might react to this new situation?
That's a tough one. I mean, we've seen him praise Putin in the past, and his approach to North Korea was all over the place. Sometimes he'd be all about the tough talk, and then he'd try to make nice with Kim Jong-un. It's really hard to predict what he'll do.
So anything is possible.
Pretty much. He might double down on supporting Ukraine and take a hard line against both Russia and North Korea.
Okay.
Or he could try to broker some kind of peace deal.
But who knows what that would look like or what kind of compromises would be involved.
Exactly.
So Trump being back just adds another layer of uncertainty to an already volatile situation. And in the middle of all this is Europe, caught between a potentially isolationist U.S. and an increasingly aggressive Russia. The article quotes Elena Prokopenko from the German Marshall Fund. She says that whatever approach the U.S. leadership takes towards Ukraine, Europe will have to step up, and we will have to take the lead in supporting Ukraine's defense efforts and macro financial stability. That sounds like a pretty clear message to me, like Europe needs to get its act together.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a wake-up call.
So what does stepping up actually mean for Europe?
Well, I think Prokopenko is saying that they can't rely on the U.S. like they used to. With Trump back and his America First agenda, Europe's security is no longer guaranteed.
Right.
So they need to figure out how to defend themselves.
And how do they do that?
Well, it means increasing their military capabilities, maybe spending more on defense and being more proactive about security issues.
Okay.
It also means they might have to take the lead on providing aid to Ukraine.
Both financial and humanitarian?
Right. They might have to fill the gap if the U.S. backs down.
So it's a tough challenge, but it sounds like they don't really have a choice.
Yeah, the current situation has really exposed Europe's weaknesses. They either become more independent or they risk getting caught in the crossfire.
So we've got North Korea entering the fray, a potentially isolationist U.S., and a Europe that needs to figure out its own path. This feels like way more than just a regional conflict. It feels like a global power shift is happening right before our eyes.
I agree.
But before we get lost in the big picture of geopolitics, let's zoom in a bit and make this personal. How could all this actually affect our listeners' lives?
Well, on a global scale, we're seeing the potential for the international order to break down.
Okay.
And that kind of instability can impact everything from trade and the economy to global security.
Right.
It could mean higher prices, disruptions to supply chains, even cyber attacks. We live in a very interconnected world, so these events, even if they seem far away, can actually have a real impact on our lives.
It's not just something we see on the news.
Exactly. And on a more individual level, I think this situation highlights how important it is to stay informed and engaged with what's happening in the world.
Right.
Understanding what's going on, why it matters, and how it could affect you is crucial in times like these.
Especially when things are so uncertain.
Exactly.
So with all these moving parts and unpredictable players, what are some scenarios that could play out?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Well, one possibility, and it's not a pretty one, is that the conflict could escalate even further. North Korea getting involved might make Russia more bold. Maybe they'll launch a bigger offensive in Ukraine. And that could provoke a stronger reaction from the U.S. and its allies, which could lead to a wider conflict. More countries getting drawn in and the stakes getting even higher.
Okay, so escalation is a possibility. What else could happen?
Another scenario is that things kind of stall out. We end up with a stalemate, a war of attrition where neither side can really win.
A long, drawn-out war.
Yeah, basically. It would be a humanitarian disaster. The Ukrainian people would continue to suffer, and the whole region would be destabilized.
So either things get worse, or we're stuck in a never-ending war. Neither option sounds very appealing. Is there any chance of a peaceful resolution at this point?
There's always a chance, but it's going to be really tough. To get a negotiated settlement, everyone would have to be willing to compromise. But there's so much mistrust and so many different interests at play. Reaching a lasting agreement is going to be incredibly difficult.
It sounds almost impossible, like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while you're on a roller coaster. So what should our listeners be paying attention to in the coming weeks and months? What are some signs that could tell us which way things are headed?
We'll keep an eye on how the U.S. reacts to North Korea. Do they come out strong with more sanctions and increased military pressure? Or do they try to avoid making things worse by being more cautious? That's going to be a big clue.
Okay, so the U.S. response is key.
Definitely. Also, watch what China does. Will they try to use their economic power to rein in North Korea? Or will they quietly back Russia? China's actions could have a huge impact on how this all plays out.
So we got to keep an eye on China as well.
Absolutely. And of course, pay attention to what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. How do the North Korean troops change things militarily? Do we see a surge in fighting? Or does the conflict settle into that stalemate we talked about? Those battlefield developments will tell us a lot.
It's like we're watching a high-stakes poker game
Yeah.
with the fate of whole nations hanging in the balance. And it's easy to get caught up in the strategies and the power plays. But we can't forget that this isn't just a game. There are real people whose lives are at stake. This war has already caused so much suffering. Countless lives lost, millions of people, displaced families torn apart. And with North Korea now involved, the potential for even more devastation is terrifying.
It is. It's easy to get caught up in the political maneuvering and the military stuff. But we can't forget about the human cost of this conflict. The people caught in the crossfire, the families struggling to survive, the children whose lives are forever changed by this. Those are the real tragedies of war.
It's a sobering reminder that behind every headline, behind every statistic, there are real people whose lives have been shattered. The courage of the Ukrainian people in the face of all this is truly inspiring.
It really is. And it's not just the Ukrainians. There are so many people and organizations working tirelessly to provide aid and support, to offer a glimmer of hope in these dark times. From humanitarian groups delivering essential supplies to volunteers risking their lives to evacuate civilians. These acts of compassion and solidarity are what keep humanity going.
It's important that we don't just stand by and watch. We need to support those humanitarian efforts, speak out for the people who are suffering, and push for peaceful solutions. We can't allow ourselves to become numb to the human cost of this conflict.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of this crisis, but every little thing we do can make a difference. Donating to reputable aid organizations, raising awareness on social media, contacting our elected officials to demand action. These are all ways we can contribute to a more peaceful and just world.
It's a good reminder that even when things seem hopeless, our individual actions can add up and make a real difference. We can push back against the darkness and show that hope, compassion, and the pursuit of peace will never be extinguished.
I like that. And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I keep thinking about something. With North Korea now part of this conflict, what are some of the long-term consequences that we might not be thinking about right now? The things that could really change the world as we know it?
That's a great question, and a perfect way to transition into our final thoughts. We've gone from North Korean troops on the ground in Ukraine to the possibility of global instability and even the threat of nuclear war. And it feels like we've only just scratched the surface of what this could all mean for the future. It's like we started with this one event, these North Korean troops showing up in Ukraine, and now we zoomed out and we're looking at the whole world wondering what could happen next.
Exactly. And what we're seeing is much bigger than just one conflict. This could be a turning point for global affairs. One of the things I'm most worried about is what this means for international norms and institutions. The rules-based order that came out of World War II, the idea that countries should respect each other's borders and resolve disputes peacefully, all of that's under a lot of pressure right now.
So the idea that countries can't just invade each other whenever they feel like it, that's being tested.
Yeah, and if we let aggression win in Ukraine, if powerful countries can just redraw borders by force without any serious consequences, it could set a really dangerous precedent for other conflicts around the world.
So it's not just about Ukraine, it's about the whole system.
Exactly, and it could lead to a world where where international law is ignored and smaller countries are at the mercy of their bigger neighbors.
A world where it's basically a free-for-all.
It's a scary thought, and it's why this conflict has such huge implications. We're not just talking about the fate of Ukraine, we're talking about the future of the international system and the principles that have kept things relatively stable for decades.
Okay, so that's one big concern. What else should we be worried about long-term?
Honestly, the thing that keeps me up at night is the possibility of nuclear proliferation. North Korea being involved raises some really serious questions about weapons technology being transferred, or even, and I hate to even say this, the potential use of nuclear weapons.
You're not just saying that to scare people, are you? I mean, the idea of nuclear war, it's something we've lived with for a long time, but it feels like the threat is more real now with North Korea in the picture.
I understand why you'd say that, and it's not something to take lightly. The stakes are incredibly high, and the consequences of a miscalculation or things escalating out of control are terrifying to even think about.
This whole situation is pretty overwhelming, to be honest. We started with North Korean troops in Ukraine, and now we're talking about global instability and nuclear war. It's a lot to process.
It is, and it shows how interconnected our world really is. What happens in one part of the world can have ripple effects that reach us all. It's a reminder that we can't afford to be complacent. We have to stay informed, stay engaged, and fight for the kind of world we want to live in.
So to wrap things up for our listeners, here's something to think about. In a world where alliances are shifting, power is constantly changing, and the threat of conflict is growing, what can you do to promote peace, understanding, and a more just world? It's a question we all need to grapple with and one we all have a responsibility to answer. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.